In July 1853, 4 American warships sailed into Edo Bay and anchored within sight of Japan's coast. They were painted black. Their steam engines were running, and the Japanese watching from the shore had never seen a ship that moved without sails. For 250 years, Japan had been closed. No Japanese citizen was permitted to leave. No foreigner was permitted to enter. Ships that approached without authorization were fired upon. The penalty for attempting to leave the country was death. Inside those closed borders, Japan had built something extraordinary. A civilization so internally complete, so culturally refined, so socially organized that historians now compare it to a controlled experiment in what human society when it develops entirely without outside interference for 2.5 centuries. Archaeologists excavating the old harbour defences at Shimoda have found gun emplacements designed to repel wooden sailing ships, weapons that would have been useless against steam-powered iron hulls. The military technology protecting Japan in 1853 was the same technology Japan had in 1603. The world outside had not stood still. So here is the question that has divided historians for 170 years. Was Japan's 250-year isolation the greatest act of national self-preservation in history, or the most expensive mistake any civilization ever made? Before Tokugawa Ieyasu sealed Japan's borders and imposed 2.5 centuries of enforced peace, Japan had spent over a century tearing itself apart in a conflict so prolonged and so total that historians gave it a name that translates simply as the Warring States period, the Sengoku, which began in the mid-15th century and did not end until Ieyasu's final victory in 1615. The Sengoku was not a war with two sides. It was a continuous overlapping series of conflicts among the daimyo, the great lords who controlled Japan's regional territories, each pursuing dominance over their neighbours while simultaneously managing threats from rivals they had not yet confronted. Alliances formed and dissolved within years, sometimes within months. Daimyo, who had been loyal vassals for decades, switched allegiance when the military balance shifted. Entire family lines were extinguished in single battles or in the systematic massacres that followed them. The scale of death during the Sengoku period is difficult to calculate precisely from the available historical records, but demographic estimates suggest that Japan's population, which had been growing steadily in the preceding centuries, stagnated or declined during the most intense phases of conflict. Cities were burned repeatedly. Agricultural land was abandoned as farmers fled fighting or were conscripted into armies. The infrastructure of irrigation, road maintenance, and food that sustained dense populations deteriorated throughout territories that changed hands repeatedly. 3 successive unifiers brought this period to a close in the latter half of the 16th century: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu, each building on the territorial and institutional foundations established by his predecessor. Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582 before completing his consolidation. Hideyoshi, who succeeded him, unified the country by 1590 but launched 2 disastrous invasions of Korea in 1592 and 1597 that exhausted his resources and undermined his legacy. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, the coalition he had constructed began to fracture immediately. The Battle of Sekigahara on October 21, 1600, was the decisive engagement that determined which of the competing factions would govern Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. Tokugawa Ieyasu commanded the Eastern coalition of daimyo against the Western coalition supporting Hideyoshi's young heir. The battle lasted approximately 6 hours. A critical defection by one of the Western coalition's senior commanders during the fighting broke the Western line, and the rout that followed was complete. Ieyasu's casualties were approximately 30,000. The Western coalition lost approximately 80,000 killed, captured, or executed in the battle and its aftermath. The magnitude of the victory was not enough by itself to end the conflict. Hideyoshi's son, Toyotomi Hideori, retained control of Osaka Castle and a remaining military following, and the legal and symbolic ambiguity of his position made him a potential rallying point for Ieyasu's opponents for 15 years. The Siege of Osaka in 1614 and 1615, in which Ieyasu's forces besieged and eventually destroyed Osaka Castle and killed Hideyori, removed the last credible challenge to Tokugawa supremacy. Japan was unified, exhausted and ready, more than ready, for the peace that Ieyasu offered. Tokugawa Ieyasu received the title of shogun, generalissimo, the military ruler of Japan, from the emperor in 1603. He transferred the title to his son Hidetada in 1605, 2 years before his own death, establishing beyond any possible misunderstanding that the shogunate was a hereditary Tokugawa institution rather than a personal grant to an individual. This transfer, made while Ieyasu was still alive and able to supervise the transition, was the single most important institutional decision of his career, and it worked exactly as intended. The Tokugawa Shogunate passed from father to son for 15 generations across 265 years. The problem that every Japanese ruler since the 10th century had faced was not winning power. It was holding it against the continuous centrifugal pressure of regional lords, whose own military forces made them potentially dangerous rivals. Ieyasu's solution was the Sankin Kotai system, the alternate itinerary that became the Tokugawa political structure's defining innovation. Under Sankin Kotai, every daimyo was required to spend alternating years in his home domain and in Edo, the Tokugawa capital, maintaining a residence and staff in both locations simultaneously. When the daimyo travelled between his domain and Edo, he was required to travel in a procession appropriate to his status, with a large retinue of retainers at enormous expense. When he returned to his domain for the alternate year, his family remained in Edo as hostages, though the system's documents never used that word. The financial consequences were precisely calculated and politically decisive. The cost of maintaining 2 full households, funding the biannual processions, and supporting the required number of retainers in both locations consumed a very large fraction of each daimyo's annual rice revenues. Estimates from Tokugawa period economic records suggest that Sankin Kotai costs absorbed between 60 and 80% of the revenues of smaller domains. A daimyo, who was spending most of his income on travel and dual establishment, had very limited resources available for the one thing that could threaten Tokugawa power: building a military force large enough to challenge the shogunate. The system also created something its designers may not have fully anticipated: a network of roads connecting every major daimyo domain to Edo, travelled constantly by large processions. That became the infrastructure of a genuinely national commercial economy. The 5 routes, the Go-Kaido, that radiated from Edo were maintained at a standard and travelled at a frequency that made possible the movement of goods, information, and people across Japan at a speed and volume that no previous Japanese political system had supported. The Sakoku, the closed country policy that defined Japan's relationship with the outside world from the 1630s until 1853, was not implemented in a single decision. It developed through a series of edicts issued between 1633 and 1639 that progressively restricted foreign contact until the isolation was nearly complete. The primary motivation, by the evidence of the edicts themselves and the administrative records of the period, was not xenophobia in any simple cultural sense. It was fear, specifically fear of 2 things that the Tokugawa leadership had observed operating in other parts of Asia: Christian missionary activity that created communities with loyalties that ran outside Japanese political authority, and European commercial and military power that had already reduced parts of Southeast Asia to colonial dependency. The Portuguese and Spanish missionaries, who had been active in Japan since the mid-16th century, had converted approximately 300,000 Japanese to Christianity by the early 17th century. These converts, concentrated particularly in Kyushu in western Japan, formed communities whose primary institutional loyalty was to the Catholic Church rather than to their daimyo or to the shogunate. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, in which approximately 30,000 Christian converts in the Shimabara Peninsula rose against their local lord, confirmed the Tokugawa leadership's worst fears about the political consequences of Christian community formation. The rebellion was suppressed with extreme force, resulting in the massacre of the rebel community. The Sakoku edicts followed directly from this experience. The Dutch East India Company was permitted to maintain a single trading post at the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbour, a tiny plot of land connected to the mainland by a single guarded bridge. The Dutch were chosen over other European trading partners specifically because they were Protestant rather than Catholic, which the Tokugawa administration associated with a more purely commercial motivation and less missionary ambition. Each year, the senior Dutch official at Dejima was required to travel to Edo and present an account of world events to the shogun, making the Dutch representative, in effect, Japan's single official source of foreign news for 2.5 centuries. Chinese and Korean merchants maintained limited contact through authorized ports, and the Ryukyu Kingdom, the island chain that is now Okinawa, served as an additional conduit for trade with China and Southeast Asia under the supervision of the Satsuma domain. But the essential reality of the Sakoku period was that Japan had removed itself from the global trade networks and the geopolitical dynamics that were reshaping the rest of the world. While European powers were establishing colonial empires across Asia, the Americas, and Africa, while the Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform the economic and military capabilities of European states, Japan was developing its own distinct internal civilization in deliberate isolation from all of it. The social structure that the Tokugawa Shogunate constructed and maintained was one of the most rigidly hierarchical systems in recorded history. A 4-tier caste arrangement that assigned every person in Japan to a fixed social position at birth and regulated their dress, diet, residence, occupation, and behavior with a specificity that modern observers find extraordinary. The 4 officially recognized classes in descending order were the samurai, the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. This ordering reflected the Confucian values that the Tokugawa administration had adopted as its ideological foundation. Warriors at the top because they protected society, farmers second because they fed it, artisans third because they made useful things, and merchants last because they produced nothing themselves but simply moved goods that others had created. Below all 4 recognized classes were the Ita and Hinin, communities whose hereditary occupations involving death, animal slaughter, and leather working placed them outside the official social hierarchy in a category of ritual impurity whose consequences for daily life were severe and pervasive. The samurai class constituted approximately 5 to 6% of Japan's population during the Tokugawa period, roughly 2 million people out of a total population that grew from approximately 12 million in 1600 to approximately 30 million by the mid-19th century. What made the Tokugawa samurai unique among military aristocracies is that they governed during the longest sustained period of domestic peace that any major civilization had experienced since the Roman Pax, approximately 250 years, without a significant internal war. The consequences of this peace for the samurai as a class were profound and paradoxical. Warriors who had no wars to fight retained their formal social position, their right to carry swords, and their stipends paid in rice, but their actual function shifted progressively toward administrative and bureaucratic roles. A samurai in the 18th century was more likely to be keeping tax records in a provincial office than wielding a weapon in a battle. The martial skills that defined samurai identity, sword technique, horsemanship, archery, the tactics of individual and unit combat, were maintained through ritual practice and school tradition rather than operational necessity. The tax system that funded this structure was built entirely on rice. Land was assessed in units of koku, 1 koku being the amount of rice required to feed 1 person for 1 year, approximately 180 litres. Daimyo domains were ranked by their assessed koku output. Samurai retainers received stipends denominated in koku. The shogunate's own revenue was measured in koku. The entire administrative and economic system of Tokugawa Japan operated through rice as its fundamental unit of value, a choice that had significant consequences when rice prices became volatile in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Bushido, the way of the warrior, is the most internationally recognized concept associated with samurai culture and also one of the most misunderstood. The word itself, and the systematic philosophical codification of warrior ethics it implies, was largely a product of the Tokugawa period rather than a description of how earlier Japanese warriors had actually operated. Samurai in the Sengoku period fought with pragmatic brutality and changed allegiances when their strategic interests required it. The warrior code that later writers systematized was in large part a retrospective idealization created during a period of peace by warriors who had nothing to fight and needed a philosophical framework to justify their privileged social position. The primary text of Tokugawa-era samurai philosophy is the Hagakure, dictated by the retired samurai Yamamoto Tsunetomo to a scribe between 1709 and 1716. Its most famous line, usually translated as "the way of the samurai is found in death," has been interpreted by later readers as a statement of fatalistic courage. In context, it is closer to an observation about psychological orientation. A samurai who has fully accepted the possibility of death at any moment is freed from the anxiety that would otherwise compromise his judgment and loyalty. The Hagakure was not widely read during the Tokugawa period itself. It became influential much later, particularly during the nationalist period of the late 9th and early 20th centuries, when Japan was constructing a historical narrative of warrior tradition to mobilize its population for modern war. The katana, the curved single-edged sword that is the most recognizable symbol of samurai culture, was not primarily a battlefield weapon. In the Sengoku period, battles were fought primarily with spears, bows, and firearms. The katana was a sidearm, a symbol of status, and a tool for the individual combat that occurred when larger formations broke. During the Tokugawa period, with no battlefield context to define its use, the katana became primarily a cultural object, an artifact of identity that samurai were legally required to carry and that swordmakers refined to extraordinary levels of metallurgical and aesthetic perfection. The sword-making tradition of Tokugawa period Japan represents one of the most technically sophisticated examples of pre-industrial metalworking anywhere in the world. The process of folding and tempering the steel, repeatedly heating, folding and hammering to distribute carbon content evenly and align the crystalline structure, produced blades whose performance characteristics have been studied by modern materials scientists with genuine admiration. The differential hardening technique, which produced a hard cutting edge and a softer, more flexible spine in the same blade, was an engineering achievement that Western metallurgists only fully understood in the 19th century. These blades were not mass-produced weapons. They were individual objects that took months to make, and that their makers understood as containing a spiritual dimension inseparable from their physical properties. The Tokugawa administrative system was, by the standards of its era, genuinely sophisticated, a multi-layered bureaucratic structure that maintained order across a diverse and geographically fragmented territory without the communications and transportation technology that modern states depend on. It was also, by any measure, a system of comprehensive social control whose reach into the daily lives of ordinary Japanese was extraordinary even by comparison with other early modern states. The senior administrative officials of the shogunate, the roju or senior councillors, managed the overall affairs of the state through a collective decision-making process that distributed responsibility and prevented any single official from accumulating the kind of personal power that could threaten shogunal authority. Below them, a hierarchy of officials managed specific domains of government: the finance magistrates who administered shogunal tax lands, the city magistrates who governed Edo and other major urban centres, the inspectors who monitored the behaviour of daimyo and reported any signs of unauthorised military build-up or suspicious political activity. The inspection system was the Tokugawa government's primary mechanism for monitoring the daimyo, the regional lords whose aggregate military power substantially exceeded the shogunate's own direct forces. Inspectors travelled regularly through the domains, reporting on daimyo behaviour, castle construction, military preparedness, and financial condition. A daimyo who was building unauthorized fortifications, accumulating unusual stores of weapons, or conducting suspicious diplomatic contacts with other daimyo or with foreign powers would find himself summoned to Edo for an explanation. The suppression of Christianity in the aftermath of the Shimabara Rebellion produced the most systematic religious control apparatus in Japanese history. The temple registration system, Terork Sido, required every Japanese family to register with a local Buddhist temple, which certified their religious status and maintained records of births, deaths, and family compositions. Christians had no Buddhist temple affiliation and therefore could not provide the documentation required for basic legal transactions. The system effectively made Christian practice impossible for anyone who wished to participate in normal social and economic life. The Kakure Kirishitan, hidden Christians, who maintained their faith secretly for generations after the Sakoku edicts, represent one of the most remarkable religious survival stories in history. Cut off from any contact with Catholic clergy for over 2 centuries, communities in the Nagasaki region maintained practices that combined Christian prayers and iconography with the external forms of Buddhist and Shinto practice required by the Terork system. When Japan opened in the 1850s and Catholic missionaries returned, they discovered these communities still practicing a recognizable version of the faith their ancestors had been forced underground in the 1630s. For the approximately 30 million people living in Japan by the mid-18th century, the Tokugawa period was not primarily experienced as an era of national isolation or political philosophy. It was experienced as the specific texture of daily life in a society whose rhythms, constraints, and opportunities were shaped by the shogunate's administrative decisions in ways both visible and invisible. The agricultural foundation of Tokugawa society rested on wet rice cultivation, an agricultural system whose combination of high caloric yield and intensive labor requirement had shaped the social organization of Japanese villages for centuries. Rice paddies required coordinated water management across multiple land holdings, which created incentives for village-level cooperation and the collective maintenance of irrigation infrastructure. The village community, the Mura, was the basic administrative unit of the Tokugawa countryside, responsible not just for tax collection but for road maintenance, fire prevention, policing minor offences, and the social welfare of its members. The tax burden on farming communities was substantial. The Tokugawa period's most common tax assessment principle, the 4:6 ratio, splitting the rice harvest roughly 40% for the farmer and 60% for the lord, was a target rather than a ceiling, and the actual extraction rate varied significantly by domain and by the competence and honesty of local tax officials. Years of poor harvest reduced farmer incomes while tax obligations remained relatively fixed, creating cycles of indebtedness and land loss that progressively concentrated landholding in the hands of more prosperous village families at the expense of smaller farmers. Urban life in the Tokugawa period developed a commercial and cultural vitality that coexisted with the rigid formal social hierarchy in ways that the hierarchy's designers had not anticipated. The merchant class, officially ranked last in the social order, accumulated the wealth that the samurai class, officially ranked first, was increasingly unable to generate through their rice stipends. Wealthy merchants in Edo and Osaka lived in material comfort that exceeded what most samurai could afford, employed samurai as clerks and accountants, and funded the cultural productions, the kabuki theatre, the woodblock print, the popular novel, that defined the distinctive aesthetic of Tokugawa urban culture. The kabuki theatre deserved particular attention as a cultural institution. Beginning in the early 17th century as a street performance tradition associated with female and then young male performers, kabuki had by the 18th century developed into a sophisticated theatrical form with elaborate stagecraft, a large repertoire of historical and contemporary plays, and a star performer culture whose parallels with modern celebrity culture are striking. Kabuki theatre was not a refined aristocratic entertainment. It was a popular commercial form that drew audiences from across the social spectrum and that dealt, often in thinly veiled allegory, with the tensions and contradictions of Tokugawa social life. Edo, the Tokugawa capital, the city that would be renamed Tokyo at the Meiji Restoration, was by the early 18th century the largest city in the world, with a population estimated at approximately 1 million people. This claim requires some qualification. Contemporary European cities like London and Paris were smaller, but they were growing rapidly while Edo's growth had largely stabilized. What makes the comparison meaningful is what a city of 1 million people in the early 18th century implied about the administrative, commercial, and agricultural systems capable of sustaining it. Feeding 1 million people required a supply chain of extraordinary scale and reliability. Rice arrived in Edo by boat from agricultural regions across Japan, moving along coastal shipping routes that connected the shogunate's tax domains to the city's rice warehouses. Fish, the primary protein source for Edo's population, arrived daily from the fishing fleets that worked the waters of Edo Bay and the Pacific coast, sold through the Nihonbashi fish market, whose successors still operate as the Tsukiji and Toyosu markets today. Vegetables, sake, cotton textiles, and thousands of other commodities moved along the road network and coastal shipping routes in volumes that required specialized merchant houses, standardized weights and measures, and financial instruments, bills of exchange, credit notes, whose sophistication matched anything available in contemporary European commercial centers. The physical structure of Edo was shaped by two competing imperatives: defense against the political threats the Tokugawa feared most, insurrection and fire, and accommodation of the enormous commercial activity that the city's population required. The Edo castle complex at the city's centre occupied a site of approximately 230 hectares, making it one of the largest castle complexes ever built. Its concentric moat systems and massive stone walls were designed to be defensible against samurai assault, the specific military technology that the Tokugawa worried about. They were of limited use against the fires that repeatedly devastated the city's densely packed wooden residential districts. Fire was the defining disaster of Tokugawa urban life. The Meireki fire of 1657 burned for 3 days, destroyed approximately 2/3 of Edo's buildings, and killed an estimated 100,000 people. More than the Great Fire of London 9 years later in a city that was by comparison lightly populated. Edo rebuilt after the Meireki fire and burned repeatedly again in subsequent decades. The architectural response was pragmatic rather than technological. Buildings were kept small, streets were maintained as fire breaks, and professional firefighting organizations, the Machiki Joshu, became a significant feature of Edo's civic infrastructure. But the fundamental vulnerability of a city of wooden buildings in a climate with dry winters and strong winds was never solved during the Tokugawa period, and major fires remained regular catastrophic events throughout the era. The religious landscape of Tokugawa Japan was defined by a deliberate political management of spiritual life that used both Buddhism and Shinto as instruments of social control while simultaneously maintaining a genuine engagement with their theological and philosophical dimensions. Buddhism had been present in Japan since the 6th century CE, when it arrived from Korea and China and was adopted by the imperial court as an ideological resource for legitimizing centralized authority. The Tokugawa administration's temple registration system, which required every Japanese family to maintain Buddhist temple affiliation as proof of non-Christian status, gave the Buddhist clergy an administrative function that provided institutional security in exchange for cooperation with state authority. The result was a Buddhist establishment that was stable, financially comfortable, and largely depoliticized, which suited the shogunate's interests precisely. The Shinto tradition, Japan's indigenous religious system, centered on the veneration of kami, the divine spirits inhabiting natural phenomena, specific places, and revered ancestors, occupied a more complex political position in the Tokugawa period. The imperial family's authority derived ultimately from their claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, which made Shinto the theoretical source of the emperor's legitimacy. The Tokugawa Shogunate governed in the emperor's name but kept the imperial family politically powerless in Kyoto, far from the actual center of authority in Edo. Managing the relationship between imperial Shinto legitimacy and Tokugawa political reality required careful ideological navigation. The Tokugawa period, philosophical school of Neo-Confucianism, provided the intellectual framework within which this navigation occurred. Neo-Confucian thought, which emphasized hierarchical social relationships, loyalty to superiors, and the maintenance of the existing social order as a moral good, aligned perfectly with the shogunate's political interests. The shogunate promoted Neo-Confucian education in the official domain schools that trained samurai administrators and supported scholarly production that developed Neo-Confucian arguments for Tokugawa legitimacy. The samurai's relationship with death, institutionalized in the practice of seppuku, ritual self-disembowelment, as a response to defeat, dishonor, or the death of one's lord, represented the spiritual dimension of warrior identity made visible. Seppuku was not common in daily Tokugawa life. It was a formal, prescribed response to specific circumstances rather than a casual practice, but its existence as a defined option, a way of resolving certain kinds of honor conflicts through voluntary death rather than flight or compromise, shaped the psychological environment in which samurai operated and contributed to the quality of fatalistic commitment that made the Khalsa army's Western observers use similar language about Sikh soldiers. These were men who had genuinely internalized the possibility of death as a normal outcome of their professional commitments. The Sakoku policy did not eliminate Japan's curiosity about the world it had sealed itself away from. What it did was create a specific limited channel through which knowledge of the outside world could enter Japan, the Dutch connection at Dejima, and a specific intellectual tradition, the Rangaku or Dutch learning, that developed around the study of European science and technology through Dutch language sources. The Rangaku tradition began in the late 17th century, when the shogunate relaxed the prohibition on importing Dutch books, originally imposed as part of the isolation measures. Dutch language texts on medicine, astronomy, physics, botany, and military technology began arriving at Dejima and being translated laboriously by scholars who had to construct a Japanese vocabulary for concepts that had no existing Japanese equivalents into readable form for Japanese readers. The medical dimension of Rangaku was the area of most immediate practical consequence. Traditional Japanese medicine, based on Chinese classical texts and centuries of domestic practice, had developed effective treatments for many conditions, but lacked the anatomical knowledge that European medicine had developed through systematic dissection. In 1771, a group of Japanese physicians attended the dissection of an executed criminal in Edo and compared what they observed with the illustrations in a Dutch translation of a German anatomical atlas. The correspondence between the Dutch illustrations and the actual human body was far more precise than anything in the Chinese classical texts they had been using. The experience prompted Sugita Genpaku and his colleagues to translate the Dutch anatomical atlas into Japanese, producing Kaitai Shinsho, the new book of anatomy, published in 1774, an event that is often identified as the beginning of modern medicine in Japan. The astronomical tradition in Tokugawa Japan was sophisticated and genuinely engaged with European advances. Japanese astronomers obtained Dutch texts on Copernican heliocentric astronomy and integrated their findings into a domestic tradition that had, by the early 19th century, produced accurate star charts and celestial mechanics calculations comparable to European work of the same period. The shogunate's official astronomers used these capabilities for practical purposes. Calendar reform, navigation guidance for the coastal shipping that supplied Edo, while remaining officially committed to a cosmological framework predominant that did not acknowledge the full implications of what their astronomical observations showed. The irony of the Rangaku tradition is that its very existence demonstrated that the Sakoku policy's information isolation was imperfect. A significant number of Japanese scholars, concentrated particularly in Nagasaki, where contact with Dutch traders was most accessible, developed genuinely sophisticated knowledge of European science and technology during the isolation period. When Perry's ships arrived in 1853, Japan was not completely ignorant of what the outside world had been doing. It was, however, unable to translate that knowledge into the industrial and military capability that would have made a meaningful response possible. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay on July 8, 1853, with 4 warships, 2 steam-powered and 2 sailing, carrying a letter from President Millard Fillmore to the Japanese Emperor, requesting the opening of Japanese ports to American trade and the establishment of coaling stations for American ships crossing the Pacific. He anchored his ships within sight of Edo, refused Japanese requests to move them to Nagasaki, where the shogunate's protocols for foreign contact were established, and delivered his letter with the explicit statement that he would return the following year with a larger fleet for Japan's answer. The psychological impact on the Japanese observers, officials, soldiers, and ordinary residents of the coastal communities who could see the black-hulled ships from shore has been described in Japanese sources from the period with a consistency that conveys something close to ontological shock. The ships were large. They moved against the wind and current without sails, propelled by a technology that had no precedent in anything the observers had seen. They carried guns whose bore diameter was larger than anything in the Tokugawa coastal defences, and they had arrived without any warning that the shogunate's intelligence system had provided. The internal Japanese response to Perry's visit divided the shogunate and the country along a fault line that had been developing for years. The question was not simply whether to open Japan, though that was the immediate practical issue. The question was whether the Tokugawa Shogunate had the competence and the legitimacy to govern Japan's response to a world that it had demonstrably failed to monitor adequately during the 250 years of isolation. The Joy movement, Expel the Barbarians, argued that Japan should resist any foreign presence on its territory by military force. Advocates pointed to the Chinese experience with European military pressure, the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, in which Britain had forced trading concessions from China at gunpoint as evidence of what happened to Asian civilizations that accommodated Western demands. The counter-argument, increasingly compelling to anyone who had actually observed what Perry's ships could do, was that military resistance was simply impossible. The Tokugawa coastal defences were wooden gun emplacements armed with cannon of a type that had been standard in European navies a century earlier. Against steam-powered iron-hulled warships carrying rifled artillery, they were irrelevant. Perry returned in February 1854 with 8 ships. The Convention of Kanagawa, signed on March 31, 1854, opened 2 Japanese ports to American ships and established the framework for the further treaty negotiations that followed over the next several years. The Sakoku policy that had defined Japan for 250 years was over. The 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule represented, in measurable terms, the most sustained period of peace and internal development in Japanese history, a baseline of stability against which all subsequent Japanese experience has been measured and found, in various ways, wanting. Population growth across the Tokugawa period reflects the peace dividend in the most basic possible terms. Japan's population grew from approximately 12 million in 1600 to approximately 30 million by 1720, a 150% increase in 120 years, driven primarily by the security of agricultural land from military disruption and the development of irrigation and cultivation techniques that extended rice production into previously marginal land. After 1720, population and growth slowed significantly, partly due to deliberate fertility limitation in farming communities facing the constraints of fixed land area, partly due to periodic famine. But the base achieved during the Tokugawa peace was the foundation on which subsequent Japanese modernization would build. The cultural production of the Tokugawa period was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The woodblock print tradition, ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, produced images that became, after Japan's opening in the 1850s, among the most influential visual art of the 19th century in Europe. Monet collected Japanese prints. Van Gogh copied them directly. The influence of Japanese visual composition on European Impressionism and Post-Impressionism represents one of the most significant cross-cultural artistic exchanges in modern history. Enabled by the quality of an art form that developed in commercial popular Tokugawa urban culture without any reference to European aesthetic traditions. The literary tradition of the period produced the haiku as a refined poetic form, 17 syllables capturing a moment of perception in a way that has proved translatable across languages and cultures with remarkable fidelity, and the novels and stories of Ihara Saikaku and others that documented the lives of Tokugawa merchants, samurai, and ordinary urban people with a realism and irony that anticipates the European novel tradition. These literary forms, like the visual arts, were primarily products of the commercial urban culture that the rigid social hierarchy officially disdained but practically depended on. The piece that made this cultural flowering possible was, however, a piece that had been purchased at the specific cost of the adaptability that every civilization eventually needs. 2.5 centuries without external military pressure, external trade competition, or external intellectual challenge had produced a sophisticated and internally rich culture that was genuinely unprepared, not just militarily, but institutionally and psychologically, for the kind of rapid transformation that Perry's arrival made unavoidable. The Tokugawa system's structural vulnerabilities had been accumulating for decades before Perry's ships appeared in Edo Bay, and understanding them is essential to understanding why the shogunate collapsed so quickly once the external pressure began. The rice economy was the first and most fundamental problem. The Tokugawa fiscal system was denominated in rice at a time when Japan's commercial economy had been developing throughout the 18th century. A sophisticated monetary sector based on gold and silver coinage and commercial credit instruments. Rice prices fluctuated with harvest conditions in ways that disrupted samurai stipend values unpredictably. A samurai whose stipend was fixed at a certain koku assessment might find that the rice he received in a good harvest year was worth substantially less in market terms than in a bad year, because abundant supply reduced the price. The result was a samurai class that was formally privileged but practically impoverished, increasingly dependent on merchant credit and correspondingly resentful of the merchants they officially outranked. The great famines of the Tokugawa period, the Kyoho famine of the 1730s, the Tenmai famine of the 1780s, and the Tempo famine of the 1830s, each killed hundreds of thousands of people, triggered peasant uprisings in affected regions, and demonstrated that the shogunate's administrative apparatus was inadequate for managing the large-scale food distribution challenges that recurring famine created. The Tempo famine was particularly significant. It triggered the Osaka uprising of 1837, in which a former city magistrate named Oshio Heihachiro led an armed attack on Osaka's wealthy merchant quarters in protest against the merchants' hoarding of rice while the poor starved. The uprising was suppressed within a day, and Oshio killed himself. But the fact that a former Tokugawa official had led an armed revolt against the system he had served was a signal of institutional crisis that the shogunate's leadership did not adequately process. The samurai class's economic deterioration had produced, by the early 19th century, a significant population of lower-ranking samurai whose stipends were insufficient to maintain the lifestyle their status required. These men, educated, trained in martial arts and administration, and increasingly aware that the system that was failing them financially was also failing Japan strategically, were the social base from which the reform movements of the 1840s and 1850s would draw their energy. They had the skills to analyze Japan's situation, the institutional knowledge to understand where the shogunate was failing, and the grievances to motivate action. The 15 years between Perry's first arrival in 1853 and the Meiji Restoration of 1868 were among the most rapidly transformative in Japanese history. A a period during which the political, social, and military foundations of the Tokugawa system were dismantled and replaced at a speed that contemporaries found both exhilarating and terrifying. The shogunate's decision to sign the Convention of Kanagawa in 1854 and the subsequent Harris Treaty of 1858, which opened 5 Japanese ports to American trade and granted Americans extraterritorial legal rights on Japanese soil, produced an immediate political crisis. The Joy Movement's argument that Japan should expel all foreigners by force had significant support among daimyo and samurai who saw the treaties as a national humiliation. Attacks on foreign nationals in Japan increased throughout the late 1850s and early 1860s, creating a cycle of incidents that required both Japanese and Western military responses. The Western military responses were decisive in a way that settled the strategic debate definitively. In 1863, the British Navy bombarded Kagoshima, the capital of the Satsuma domain, in response to an attack on British nationals. In 1864, a combined Western fleet destroyed the coastal batteries of the Choshu domain, which had been firing on foreign ships in the Shimonoseki Strait. In both cases, the Tokugawa-era defences were destroyed in engagements that lasted hours. The message was unambiguous. Military resistance to Western demands was not an option. The domains that absorbed this lesson most quickly, Satsuma and Choshu, responded by doing something remarkable. They began modernizing their own military forces in secret, acquiring Western weapons, hiring foreign advisors, and training troops in Western tactical formations. By the mid-1860s, these domains had military forces that were significantly more capable than the shogunate's own army. Not because the shogunate had failed to modernize, but because the domain reformers had moved faster and with greater institutional flexibility than the shogunate's more rigid bureaucratic structure permitted. The Boshin War of 1868 to 1869, the civil war that ended the Tokugawa period, pitted the modernized armies of the Satsuma-Choshu alliance against shogunate forces defending the existing order. The military outcomes were consistent with the capability differential. The shogunal forces, despite fighting with genuine determination, were repeatedly defeated by opponents whose weapons and tactics were more modern. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, surrendered Edo Castle in April 1868 without the final siege that both sides had anticipated, calculating correctly that resistance would result in the city's destruction without changing the war's outcome. The Meiji Restoration that followed transferred authority, in theory, back to the Emperor Meiji, a 15-year-old whose advisors were the reformist samurai from Satsuma, Choshu, and allied domains who had organized the overthrow of the shogunate. What they built in the following decades: a modern industrial state with a conscript army, a railway network, an industrial manufacturing sector, and eventually the military power to defeat both China and Russia in conventional warfare, was one of the most rapid national transformations in history, and it was built on the foundations that the Tokugawa period had laid. A literate population, a sophisticated commercial infrastructure, an administrative tradition, and a cultural confidence in Japanese distinctiveness that modernization intensified rather than erased. The Tokugawa period ended in 1868, but it did not disappear. Its physical traces, its institutional inheritances, and the questions it raises about the relationship between civilization and cultural development, between stability and adaptability, between national self-determination and engagement with an interconnected world. These have remained central to Japanese and global historical thinking ever since. The physical archaeology of the Tokugawa period is unusually rich, precisely because the isolation and policy that defined it also, incidentally, preserved much of it. Japan's ports were not transformed by the large-scale foreign investment and commercial development that reshaped Shanghai, Bombay, and other Asian cities during the 19th century colonial period. The urban fabric of Edo and of Kyoto, Osaka, and dozens of smaller castle towns retained its Tokugawa-era character through much of the 19th century and into the 20th. The destruction of many of these urban environments came later, primarily through the American firebombing campaigns of 1944 and 1945, which burned more of Tokugawa Japan's architectural heritage in 2 years than the preceding 3 centuries had destroyed. Archaeological excavations at the sites of Tokugawa period structures, castle foundations, merchant districts, the landfill island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbour, have provided detailed information about material culture, diet, commercial activity, and social organisation that supplements the extensive written records of the period. The Dejima excavations are particularly significant. The Dutch trading post, whose records constitute much of the Western source documentation of Tokugawa Japan, has been systematically excavated since the 1990s, and the material culture recovered from its layers provides a cross-cultural perspective on Tokugawa period trade that the documentary sources alone cannot provide. The genetic and demographic research conducted on Japanese populations over the past 3 decades has confirmed the demographic consequences of the Sakoku period in ways that both support and complicate the standard historical account. Japanese genetic diversity, measured through studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers in samples from across the country, reflects the relative isolation of regional populations during the Tokugawa period, with measurable differences between communities that maintained distinct identities across the era. The genetic signature of the Tokugawa isolation is real and detectable in contemporary Japanese population data. The debate about whether the Sakoku policy was ultimately beneficial or harmful to Japan is one that historians have been conducting since the Meiji period itself, when the reformers who had overthrown the shogunate had obvious institutional interests in emphasizing the isolation's costs. The most honest assessment is that both positions contain genuine truth. The isolation preserved Japan from the colonial domination that affected most of Asia during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Philippines under Spain, and then America, India under Britain, Vietnam under France, large parts of China under various forms of European and American pressure. The cultural and social development of the Tokugawa period was genuine and produced lasting achievements. At the same time, the military and technological gap that isolation created between Japan and the industrializing West was real and dangerous, and closing it required a social transformation so rapid and so disruptive that its consequences, including the militarism that eventually led Japan to catastrophic wars in the 20th century, were themselves products of the Meiji modernization that the Sakoku period made necessary. The question that Tokugawa Japan poses most directly to the modern world is one about the terms of engagement with global systems. Japan's choice to disengage entirely for 250 years was, in the end, unsustainable, not because isolation is inherently wrong, but because the world that Japan re-engaged with in 853 had changed so dramatically during those 250 years that the cost of catching up was enormous. Every nation and civilization that chooses to develop on its own terms, apart from the dominant global system of its era, faces a version of this calculation: what you preserve by staying out and what you lose. Japan's answer after 1868 was to engage with the modern world on the most aggressive possible terms, absorbing Western technology, military organization, legal systems, and institutional frameworks at a pace that no other non-Western society matched in the 19th century. The samurai class, whose way of life the Tokugawa period had preserved for 250 years, was abolished. The feudal domain system was dissolved. Conscript armies replaced samurai retainers. The rice economy gave way to industrial capitalism. Within 50 years of Perry's black ships anchoring in Edo Bay, Japan had defeated Russia in a war that shocked every Western military analyst who had assumed that only European powers could project that kind of military force. The Tokugawa period's greatest legacy may be this: it demonstrated that a civilization can choose its own pace of development, maintain its own cultural integrity, and resist the pressures of a world that was not designed with its interests in mind. It also demonstrated that the world eventually comes to you, whether you want it or not, and when it does, the price of having stayed behind is paid all at once in a very short time by people who had no part in making the original choice. The black ships are still anchored in the historical imagination. The question they represent, whether any nation can choose its own terms for engaging with a world that does not ask permission, is still being answered by different nations in different ways right now. There is a dimension of the Tokugawa story that most Western accounts underemphasize, because it involves a kind of tragedy that is not easily categorized as either triumph or failure. It is the story of what happened to the samurai class during 250 years of peace, and what that experience reveals about the relationship between identity, purpose, and institutional survival. At the beginning of the Tokugawa period, the samurai were what their title implied, a military caste whose function was combat, whose status derived from battlefield performance, and whose cultural identity was inseparable from the preparation for and execution of violence. The Sengoku period had been their world, brutal, dangerous, and continuously demanding of exactly the skills and psychological commitments that their training and culture cultivated. The Tokugawa peace removed the context that gave samurai identity its functional meaning. This happened gradually rather than suddenly, but the trajectory was consistent. Generation by generation, across 250 years, the samurai became an administrative class that happened to carry swords rather than a warrior class that happened to administer. The practical martial skills, the ability to function effectively in the chaos of a real battle, to make rapid tactical decisions under lethal pressure, to maintain physical and psychological capability through the specific stresses of actual combat. These skills atrophied simply because there was no context in which they were needed. The elaborate martial arts traditions of the Tokugawa period, the sword schools, the archery traditions, the wrestling systems, the combat philosophies, were genuine and sophisticated, but they were preserving the form of warrior culture after its substance had been removed. A swordsman who trains for decades in a competitive school tradition becomes extremely skilled at the specific physical and tactical challenges of that tradition. He does not necessarily become a better fighter under actual battlefield conditions, because the two environments place fundamentally different demands on a person's capabilities. When the Boshin War of 1868 to 1869 tested samurai forces against opponents equipped with modern firearms, the results were exactly what this analysis would predict. Samurai courage and training were real and were demonstrated under fire repeatedly. Individual acts of extraordinary bravery occurred throughout the conflict, but courage and traditional martial skill could not substitute for the specific advantages that rifled infantry and artillery provided against opponents who had mastered their use. The samurai who fought at the Battle of Toba Fushimi in January 1868, many of them men who had devoted their entire adult lives to martial cultivation, were killed by opponents whose weapons worked at distances and with effects that no amount of sword skill or samurai spirit could bridge. The abolition of the samurai class that followed the Meiji Restoration was not, therefore, simply a political decision by a new government eliminating a potential opposition. It was a recognition of a reality that the Boshin War had demonstrated without ambiguity. The samurai as a military caste had been functionally obsolete for at least a generation before anyone was willing to say so officially. The stipends that the samurai class received were a pension for a service that had ceased to be delivered, maintained by a political arrangement that the Meiji reformers correctly identified as unsustainable in a modernizing economy that needed capital for industrial investment rather than for preserving the formal privileges of a caste whose actual function had disappeared. The Meiji government's management of the samurai class's dissolution was, by the standards of 19th century state transformation, relatively humane. Commutation of stipends into lump sum bond payments, opening of civil and military careers to merit regardless of social origin, and the creation of a new conscript army and professional civil service that absorbed many former samurai in new roles that were functionally continuous with their previous administrative experience. But the psychological and cultural disruption was real and it expressed itself in the resistance movements that punctuated the early Meiji period, culminating in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, in which approximately 40,000 former samurai, under the leadership of Saigo Takamori, one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration himself, rose against the government they had helped create in protest against the elimination of samurai privilege. The rebellion was suppressed after 6 months of fighting by the conscript army, ordinary Japanese men with modern rifles who had been trained for months rather than decades, fighting against former samurai who had devoted their lives to martial cultivation. The outcome was not close. Saigo Takamori died in the final engagement, either killed by government forces or by his own hand, according to disputed accounts. His death marked the end of the samurai as a military force and the completion of the social transformation that Perry's arrival had made inevitable 15 years earlier. The story of the samurai's long decline within the Tokugawa peace is a story about what happens when an institution whose identity is built around a specific function continues to exist after that function has been removed. The samurai carried their swords and maintained their formal status for 250 years of peace. They developed extraordinary cultural expressions of their identity. They produced philosophy, poetry, art, and administrative capability. But they could not replace the one thing that the peace had taken from them: the operational context that gave their identity its grounding in reality rather than in ritual. When the world demanded that grounding be demonstrated again in 1868, the demonstration was brief and final. The question it leaves: what happens to any group, institution, or civilization when the purpose that defined it is no longer needed, is one that the Tokugawa period poses with unusual clarity and unusual gentleness given what followed. Japan survived its encounter with the black ships. It did more than survive. It became, within 50 years, the first non-Western industrial power and the first non-Western nation to defeat a European great power in modern warfare. The Tokugawa period's legacy was not failure. It was a very long preparation for a very rapid transformation, paid for at the cost of 2.5 centuries of standing still while the world moved. Whether the price was worth it is a question that depends entirely on what you value and what you are willing to lose in order to protect it. The black ships are gone, the samurai are gone, but the Japan they shaped, disciplined, adaptive, proud, and perpetually conscious of what it means to face a world that does not accommodate on your terms, is still very much present. And the conversations that started when 4 steam-powered ships anchored in Edo Bay in the summer of 1853 has not finished yet.